We're going to start on the second session called Cultural Perspectives. So I would like to briefly introduce you to the three speakers, and we can either maybe collect questions at the end to see how much time we have left. So first up will be Megan Ankerson, who's an assistant professor in communication studies at the University of Michigan. So I've come to know her work through her software studies approaches to web history, which are incredibly valuable for the field, as well as her work on the production practices and aesthetics of Web 2.0 and the so-called .com era. And I was really happy to learn that her forthcoming book on .com design is coming out in June, July with NYU Press. Next up will be Michael Stevenson, who's an associate professor of new media and digital culture at the University of Amsterdam, who's done a very interesting work on the roots of particular media and web practices and investigating the genres and forms that are considered to be so-called web native. He's going to present today on his new and ongoing project called The Web That Was, about the Perl programming languages, but in particular about the early web and early web practices and the software development around it. And finally, we have Kevin Driscoll, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Media Studies at the University of Virginia. And he explores histories of networked personal computing. So one of his wonderful contributions to that area is his book that he published last year on the Minitel system. And prolific writer as he is, he's currently writing a book where he's trying to trace the prehistory of social media through the dial-up bulletin board system. So for us who have still worked with them, I haven't, the BBS systems of the 1980s and 1990s. So this is going to be a very exciting session, and please welcome Megan to the floor.
Okay, thank you so much. We did some testing of this PowerPoint earlier, and it kept crashing. So hopefully that is not going to be the case today. And I do have two clips that I'm going to have to exit out and bring up, so I apologize in advance for the clumsiness, I suppose, of it. Okay. So my talk today is an attempt to try to situate culturally and historically the logic of web archiving within a broader social context of emerging new media technologies and the corresponding ways of thinking about time and history, memory, archives in the future that emerge alongside new media technologies. And so there's two questions, perhaps problems, that I'm interested in engaging here. So first is, what kind of historical artifact is a web snapshot? Should we consider web archives to be primary sources? What does it mean to think of our relationship to the past in these terms? So as Niels Brugger suggested nearly a decade ago, web archives represent a new type of historical document. So what does it mean then for us today to grapple with questions of evidence, truth, and history in a digital age? What happens, in other words, when we find robots in the archive? How do we work together in order to think through what history writing, history making is in a networked environment? Second is following Derrida, not too far, but don't worry, is the question of what deeper desires or drives or what ineffable promises are configured alongside the archive itself. So in Archive Fever, Derrida suggests that which is no longer archived the same way is no longer lived the same way. And so if so, what are the implications for our contemporary milieu? And so as an entryway into these admittedly big questions, I want to take up one material semiotic thread that has historically linked new media technologies and cultural imaginaries through an enduring fantasy, time travel. And so these metaphors, time travel, time machines, time capsules, going back in time, I'm arguing are more than just myths or fiction. They are what I'm thinking about as material semiotic assemblages, these knots that are infused in the design paradigms of today's digital archiving machines. So this alert that I received on my phone told me we're going all the way back to 2011 today. So this happens all the time. I get these alerts. You have a new memory. I do, and I'll check, and there's the photo, and indeed, it's like, I remember that, you know? I'd forgotten that I remembered. I guess it is a new memory. But it's just, I can't help but notice that something new seems to be going on in the ways that we're thinking about memory, the work of memory and nostalgia as apps, and the ways that this language figures in different digital history portals and search engines and things like that. This alert is from an app called Fabric, which promises to automate the story of your life by reintroducing users to captured moments of life from different periods of time. So with this, your story is manufactured for you through your personal digital archives. And so I'm wondering, what kind of an archival experience is this? And what do fantasies of time travel tell us about a culture, about how a culture experiences the mediatization of time? How might discourses of time travel, time machines, and time capsules help us make sense of people's historically and culturally specific lived experiences of new media? Okay, so time travel provides a language and a conceptual framework for social imaginaries to cohere around shared experiences of time, memory, and history that accompany new media technologies in different moments. And we see this expression of time travel in relation to archives and digital technologies all the time, all over the place. So this is Google Maps when they introduced their historical database of street view images. They packaged it and marketed it as an experience of time travel. Similarly, this is from my Mac, which I hear hasn't been heard of here or something like this. There's much anxiety with us Mac people making the big transition. But this is the language of Mac in which I'm constantly alerted that the time machine is backed up, and that my personal time capsule has saved so many versions of my past automatically. And it becomes a way of browsing your own digital archives through the visual metaphors of what it means to engage with the history of your files in this way, creates this experience or this imaginary that's real of what time travel means today. They're countless. This is Time Hop, a capsule for you, of course. One that probably most of us are most familiar with is the Wayback Machine. But the New York Times also, when they released a new interface to their historical images of newspapers, they called this the Times Machine. So like a similar thing. Even when I booked my flight on Delta, it was like, Delta, the On Times machine. I was like, really? Wow. It really is everywhere. But interestingly, when the New York Times archives their paper, it's not a time machine, it's a morgue. And so there seems to be something, it's called the morgue, I learned, because people that worked at the Times would clip newspaper things in anticipation that someone would die, and they'd have to write an obituary. And so they would store these print files of the newspaper in this basement, underground, huge safe. But I'm really struck by the juxtaposition of the cloud and the always-on accessible archive and the buried, stored media that we used to experience it, saving it in the past. Okay, so there's some questions that I've talked a little bit about, but I'm particularly interested in what the role of these tropes, like metaphors, and mythology in the design of archives, and in the design of institutions and technical systems. So in other words, how do these cultural imaginaries that we experience figure in the built world of technology and places? And so then how can we, as media, internet scholars, web historians, educators, archivists, how can we be more reflexive about the conceptual systems through which we access historical data? Okay, so I am then going to talk about the discourses of time travel as they emerged, as they were linked to the emergence of photography and early cinema. These technologies were also novel experiences that provided new ways of experiencing time and space, and early spectators referred to them as time machines, well, cinema. The term time machine not being popular until H.G. Wells, The Time Machine in 1895. So before that, we didn't have the language of a time machine, but there was the beginning of thinking about like time capsules. What might, with photography, what might it be to store and preserve these pieces of the past? And so how do metaphors operate, not just a way to describe this technology or something that becomes attached to technology afterwards, but as part of the whole system in which we make things and we communicate with other people that we're making things with. And so the history of metaphors and computing, this goes back to the very beginning. This is a illustration from Charles Babbage's Analytical engine, but if anyone knows much about the history of this, it was again 19th century device that was never actually built in his time, but Babbage imagined how this processor works in terms of a mill and a store, and so using familiar ways of understanding what processing, what storage means, saving something for the future, how that might be translated into what we now think of as machine language. Of course, with histories of archives and historical records, there have been historians who study the history of archives recognize the ways that these archives contain not just documents and records, but methods of understanding and organizing knowledge. Archives create biases through exclusions, as we know, but also through the design of order, categories, evaluative criteria, and so on. And those who study the history of archives recognize that all archives are crucial sites for the exercise of political power. Archives are a key technology of rule. And so with so much work going into thinking about what archives meant in the 19th century, it's, I think, an opportune time for us to reflect on what archives mean for us today. And so for archive historians of archives, there has been, from what I learned, this is not what I do, but I'm very interested in reading about what other people do, but there's been a concrete turn in archive studies from like the heady, like critical theory days of the 1990s to a more like material practice, where understanding the history of archives, the idea that you can't understand the history of archives without also studying the history of paper and boxes and categorization systems through which these were built. Okay. So with photography in the 19th century, much has been written, scholarship in the history of photography and visual culture studies about the photograph's indexical link to the physical world, that by capturing something of the light waves of the real world and embedding them within the chemical emulsion of the film, that there was something that was automatic and real about photography in a way that other technologies were unable to capture prior to this. So what Barthes discusses as the noum of photography is the essence of photography is that which has been, or that which was once here, and that is not necessarily here any longer, and that this idea, memento mori, or a constant reminder when you see a photograph, is the idea that remember that you must die. However, for those who were celebrating early photography, and one of the first sites that was studied to study how early photography and time capsules were working was, some work by a scholar named Nick Yablon, who studied the history of world fairs, and in the United States, with the 100-year anniversary of the country in 1876, there were a whole bunch of big projects that were designed to reflect back on our 100 years and what does it mean to be an American, and let's, store for the future these precious records of what it means to live today. And so the idea of photography, or the way that it was sort of sold by many photographers, was the notion that it was a way of having a relationship with the future. This is another time capsule project from the World Fair of 1939. And with all of these projects, this one was not, this is the Century Safe. They were not designed to go underground. They were meant to be locked up and then topped off, meaning that you could lock this up and then add more stuff as it continues. There was much excitement about when this would be opened in like 1976. You can imagine, in 1976 in the US, they didn't quite get the reception that they might have anticipated, that the Americans of 1976 were angry and not feeling very patriotic in the same way that they were in 1876. But what I found interesting about the history of photography as time capsules is the ways that photographers taught sitters how to gaze at the future, how to hold themselves, how to pose, how to dress in order to have their likeness meet the future. And so this idea of like time travel was very important early on. So when I'm talking about the material semiotics of these time machines and these various devices, I mean, I don't know, I can't help but to look at this and find it kind of funny in a way that I don't think it was designed to be funny. But it somehow seems to speak really clearly about a very particular moment in American history that was about, you can see these white men gathered staring up at science, and they're very proud about it's going to penetrate the earth and we'll store it forever. But we don't think about archives that same way today. But of course, with distance, it becomes easier to see immediately what seems out of place. How can we look at our current moment with that same sense of distance? Can we? So this is where I quickly jump out to talk about cinema as a time machine. How do I do this? Let's see. Oh, boy. Oh, wait, here we go. Oh, but you can't see it.
You gotta drag it over.
Okay.
To the right.
To the right. There. Let's go back. Okay. Oh, okay. I have to look at this. This is. No. Nope. Oh, shoot. Gosh. Oh, no. Gets worse.
As the saying goes, once you go back, you can't go.
That's what they say. What happened? Oh, is it going forward or backwards? Actually, what's funny is this clip is exactly this point. This is now I can't remember, 1894, 1896. This is the Lumiere brothers. And this is just a segment of it. Where is that? That is called the demolition of a wall. And so what happens, as you can imagine in the suspense, but indeed the wall comes down, and this guy comes and helps to push it down. But what was exciting about film, and what was exciting about this to early cinema goers, is the way that, just as part of a public spectacle, time was being played with in new ways. So taking something like this demolition of a wall, originally filmed one way, and then having a moment in which the whole thing reverses, and then the rest of the wall now gets put back up again. So these sort of public demonstrations of the power of cinema to show duration. If the photograph was about the index, then cinema is about duration and movement. And there's much work and experimenting with going back and forth along that timeline. Okay. And I know this is cutting into my minute. Oh, is this the right one? Jump, jump, jump. Oh my God, I feel so foreign to this thing. What is it? How do I just play? Yeah, okay. Now I don't even want to show the next one. I should have showed it now. Okay, so much has been written by like film scholars like Marianne Doan, who have thought about the rise of cinema in the early 20th century alongside things like the international standardization of time, the creation of time zones, the coordination of railways. And so what was the experience of a subject? How does the subject inhabit this space and time? And so I'm interested in this question about digital time machines, and Neil nicely went over the first one. I don't even have to explain because it's not the difference between taking an object and converting it, an analog to digital conversion versus a web archive, is a very different experience. And in order to make sense of it, in my final, 2 minutes, I suggest that we revisit, or I guess remind ourselves of some of the principles of new media that Lev Manovich, probably close to two decades ago now, was first making sense of when thinking about the language of new media. And 3 that he emphasizes that are cascading, so they're linked to one another, are these principles of modularity, breaking everything up into small pieces. Everything can be a tiny unit. Variability, because of this, they can be recombined in endless potential ways. And automation, not only can they be recombined in endless ways, but that process can be automated. So what happens just with those 3 ingredients? A whole bunch of new possibilities. And so what we find with things like a web archive, as Niels also talked about today, and as Wendy Chun has written about, she uses the term eternal ephemeral to try to make sense of this web archive as a unique document that is not just a simple copy of the original, especially in like digital culture. I think we're used to thinking of a digital copy as being an exact replicant, but that's not what we're seeing here. With the digital time machines that we experience today, search engines, maps, apps, the things that seem to most distinguish digital archives in terms of the time machine discourse is the ways that digital time machines are everyday experiences instead of experiences that you have to arrange in advance or have special access or at least go to a building. They are individualized and personalized, that archives can be created just for you. And they're collaboratively generated artifacts. And by suggesting they're collaboratively generated, I'm referring to the collaboration between machines and humans working together to create these so that I can get an alert. Here's one of my memories from Facebook that tells me 1 year ago this happened. But the reason why this became a memory, I uploaded it, but it was the work of my friends who liked it enough for it to be able to signal memory, right? So it was their work, plus the archives, plus the liking, plus my timeline, all of this together that creates these networks of humans and non-humans. So the state of temporality that I guess I'll leave us with today is this multiple collapsed, partial, fragmented, hyperlinked experience that for some reason we don't always tend to, I don't know, see as fragmented as they actually are. So with web archives, as we know, or as we've learned, you can't see this very well, but you can go in and you can, press a button and you can see how each one of the files within this archive was saved at a different moment. So here we have just a fusion of all of these different temporalities that coexist within this document. So it's really important for historical research, what's the paper and boxes that we're looking at if we're looking at digital material? And how, in a whole bunch of different cultural ways, art, photography, expression, are the ways of playing with or recognizing these multiple temporalities. There was this trend a while ago, then and now, remix photography, people taking pictures of like the same moment in different times. And then I will conclude, I guess, with my last video that is, please let me be able to do it right. I'm just gonna shut that down, and where'd my thing go? This is just, I tried to avoid this by embedding my videos, and that's how I got into this in the first place. Okay. This is an experience using Google Maps to drive down a street I lived in. But what I find so interesting is just the experience of going down the street, of jumping right here. Wait, that's my house. But wait, let me go back. Oh, okay, wait, now I'm in 2014. Let me spin around. Is the door to my house orange in this, world? And I'll like spin back around and try to, make sense of it. Yeah, this is gonna be the one with the orange hat. It's a sunnier, life got better in 2014. What's interesting also is when I show my students this clip, they don't notice at all. They say, yeah, it's just like walking down the street. I'm like, yeah, just like walking down the street? They're like, just like it. I'm like, I don't know that experience of like, suddenly it's 2007. But the fact that that doesn't strike them as bizarre, I think is very important to recognize about media and time in our current moment. So thank you.
Just out of curiosity, what was the impetus for the time travel? What was the impetus for the time travel metaphor, or that beautiful term you used of material semiotics?
Oh, well, material semiotics comes from Donna Haraway. And it's sort of I like to think of it as a more feminist version of actor network theory and STS stuff. But time travel, that's all thanks to the Wayback Machine. So thanks, Mark. And I was really curious about how, and learning about how the history of, what I learned in the history of the Wayback Machine. Mark, you could say a lot more about this, but Brewster was inspired by a 1960s Cold War cartoon that was a segment called Peabody's Improbable History, which actually is a perfect example of a web archive because they keep on going back in time and encountering a history that never existed, and they've got to, like most time travelers, fix it before they go back again. So again, like this relationship between media and memory and just, cultural experiences and then the stuff we make.
Amazing, thank you.
Thanks, thank you.
So thank you so much, Megan. And next up we have Michael Stevenson.
So I'm to blame for the extended screen problem. So it's only going to be sort of karma whenever mine completely crashes and messes up the entire time. Let's see. Okay, so my talk has a very long and complicated title that you can ignore. It is basically about value. I'm interested in value in two senses. From a historical perspective, interested in the values expressed or manifested in early web production. Also, in the second sense, I'm hoping this talk can add to a discussion of what we value or deem worthy in the work of archiving and preserving the web. Underlying both of these points is a broader sort of question of how we value the web and technology. Of course, there is monetary value. There is its value as infrastructure, as stuff that we don't want to break because it'll ruin our day, or more. There is, of course, also its value as a commons or a shared cultural heritage. And as I'll return to a couple of times in this talk, there is its value as a medium of creative expression. And with that, I mean more than writing your sort of blog or diary or making a meme. I mean also sort of expressing yourself with the technology itself. And so more specifically, the talk is about this case study. It's about a particular piece of software and two websites that were built with it. So this is the Everything Development Engine, and it was software for building and maintaining complex web applications. So today we would use the term web framework. You can still find it on SourceForge, which I hope is well archived, because who knows how long that will last. But its development essentially ended in 2003. So this was software for building sites. And so it's kind of, it sort of ended in 2003. But there are still two websites that are built on top of this software, so that run heavily modified versions of this software. So this is everything2.com. And it's important to note that the Everything engine was built with this website in mind. So Everything 2 is a collaborative media site, and you can think of it as a strange cross between Wikipedia, Urban Dictionary, if you know that, and something like LiveJournal with kind of personal expression in there. On the site, you can create your account, and then you can add a write-up or article to any one of thousands of topics. But where, for example, Wikipedia enforces a neutral point of view, Everything 2 encourages a kind of esoteric point of view. So you'll find things like dream logs and poetry and short stories alongside factual articles and like commentaries on global politics. It's a really heterogeneous mix. I mean, the community is quite small these days. It's a really heterogeneous mix, though, that is linked together by hypertext and organized through collaborative filtering and user recommendation. So very much like the social media of today, but remember, this was created in 1999. Actually, 1998, really, the first version. So the site was created by a guy named Nate Ostendorp, and as he built it, he realized he could use this software for other websites. So in this way, kind of, I mean, I don't know if you would call it the first web framework, but definitely the first open source web framework, I would say. And so he kind of abstracted the engine and decided to start building more sites with it. So together with his pals, and employees as well, he started a site called Pearl Monks, another community website that is still around. This one is a precursor to things like Stack Overflow, which programmers use. It's like a Q&A reference format. And as I'll explain later, both these sites have been maintained by volunteers for more than 15 years. So after the Everything engine when they stopped developing that was also the time when the whole company sort of was disbanded and these sites became volunteer run. This is what the underlying engine looks like, the Everything engine in a sort of mono browser. It was very advanced for its time with the same kind of, this is great, synergy, with the same kind of modularity and automation. You see with modern web frameworks, the most interesting feature was probably the fact that you could edit the source code, almost all of it, from the browser itself, which is unheard of, but it speaks to a kind of playfulness. So you could easily play around with the site and just, from the browser, make some changes in the Perl scripts, and the site would just be completely different. You could sort of really play with it a lot. And this is actually a recent screenshot as some friends helped me to emulate an early version of Debian to get this running on a virtual machine. My plan is to put that machine online, so if you want to download this, play around with it, and maybe run a website on a really archaic form of software from 1999, you can do it. So there are a number of relevant stories to tell about everything and about the history of its production and the sites that were built with it, and also stories to tell about why or how it might be preserved. It might be too much to do this, but I'm going to try and go through each of these, and then at the end, tie them together through this notion of value. So I'll start with the social and historical context, what we could call a riches to rags story from the dot-com bubble. So the guys that created this, first thing to note is that it was the same group of friends that created a site called Slashdot. Can I get hands of who knows Slashdot? So not that many of you. It was a very big, very important tech news site that spread news about open source software, and it was very innovative and very popular, and it kind of emerged during a rise in financial speculation around open source technology in the late 1990s. And these guys were able to sell the site for a decent sum of money. This put them in somewhat of a unique position. They felt they were doing what they loved and expressing themselves creatively through this technology while also making money, things that don't always go together. The company name was Blockstackers Intergalactic, to give you a sense of their character and their sort of approach to business. And this is another example. So it's important to understand the Everything Engine as a product of a particular moment and context where it seemed one could have it both ways. As their company website put it, you didn't have to choose between making money and making cool stuff. So a question then is, what becomes possible in a situation like this? And how is this different from maybe what came later? So the second story is how everything both resembles today's social media, as I already kind of noted, while also offering a vision of something different, something we could call a path not taken. In terms of the similarities, there are a number of interesting ways the software anticipated things, like collaborative filtering within participatory and social media, so the way we vote on things and they rise to the top of our Facebook feed or whatever, or our memories these days. Some are funny coincidences, like the like button. They also had a dislike button in this first version of everything. More interesting are the links below. I'm going to get really geeky for a second, so sorry. These are related pages, and they're created through implicit feedback. They're based on the paths that readers would take through the website. As one of the creators explained to me, he said the web itself is kind of a broken form of hypertext where you lose the backlinks. And this is a way of kind of getting that back. You see these paths that people take, and they were using really clever ways of hacking the HTTP requests, the URLs, to basically create API calls before you had them and sort of change the database while people were surfing through the site, and you would get really interesting effects. So these sort of links at the bottom would kind of appear organically over time and change. But everything was also very different from today's social media. One difference was the business model, a product of historical context. All of the data that they were collecting about how users were navigating through the site and whatnot, it wasn't used to sell advertising. And this was a fact that was both in line with their ethics as sort of open source, privacy conscious technologists, but also with the fact that targeted advertising just had not taken off at this point. Still, the idea was to make money from banner ads. So it's important to see that in everything, the creators made a decision early on that links would only be internal. It'd be a kind of closed system. much like the walled gardens we think of, where Facebook tries to do everything to keep you inside the site. And this is, of course, part of the context of banner ads, and you want as many hits as possible. But it also fit, I believe, with the kind of creative vision. What also set it apart, I think, is how it simultaneously encouraged a kind of collaborative media production. Let's write these articles together, and a focus and emphasis on authorship and recognition. So it encouraged participation. You would gain experience points. You would gain it by writing stuff, but also by reading stuff and recommending stuff. So your kind of place in the social hierarchy would be kind of an expression of your overall participation. And with this, you were able to unlock achievements such as the ability to add an image to your personal page at a time when storage and bandwidth were at a premium. So things like that, and eventually to things like being part of the editorial team moderating the site. And this is perhaps the most important difference I see with today's commercial social media. The data gathering and metrics are definitely there, and part of the reason is to keep people clicking and coming back. But part of the reason is also to encourage and measure a level of trust to bring these users into a kind of governance structure. And so it's really important here that the metrics and the gamification of the site are not just about ego fulfillment or superficial enjoyment, but also about facilitating a social process by which people gain the status and this feeling of ownership and the kind of actual access in terms of being able to moderate or change the site or things like this. So it's important to remember, there's a third story, it's important to remember in our present context that preservation is inherent to the work of web production. This is something that goes to the very heart of the things that Niels was talking about. After all, a website has to be stored somewhere in order to be transmitted. Additionally, it needs to be maintained as HTML specifications change, as the implementations in browsers change, as user expectations change. All these things, someone has to do the work of updating and maintaining the code. And when you have 20 years worth of old stuff that you can't migrate to some other platform, that can be really difficult and time-consuming. So there's another story here that I want to highlight about some great kind of against the odds preservation and maintenance efforts by a small army of distributed volunteers. Why did these websites survive and not so many others? What were the conditions for success? What motivates them? And so on. And to talk about this, I'll show a clip. I'm making some interviews. Right? I just decided on a whim to do this a few weeks ago. But as in the US, I started interviewing these guys about this and putting it on video, and I'm going to make a little documentary to go along with the everything with the virtual machine. And so I asked this guy. His name is Chromatic. His real name's Shane. He is he's a really prominent member of the Perl community and a really interesting, really nice guy. And one of the guys who kept Perl Monks running after block stackers and the everything engine were disbanded. And here I've asked him, what kept Perl Monks running? And he'll be referring to Tim Vroom, who was the lead developer and editor on Perl Monks. So let's listen to what he says kept it going. The video worked before. Here we go.
And so one of the things that Tim did that was pretty good was he gave access to not only those of us who were working at block stackers, but a handful of trusted users to have access to the source code of the site, the SQL of the site, and so on and so forth. And it's pretty much a volunteer thing. It's pretty much a shoestring thing, but it's kept it running for a long time past when block stackers shuttered, when Perl Monks would have shuttered because of that. And so that was a good foresight, but I think it was also Tim's ability and the moderator's ability, the God's ability to curate a community of people who cared enough to keep it running made that feasible in a way that wouldn't have been otherwise. And again, I want to give Tim a lot of credit for this. You don't see that with something like Dig, which I don't know if it's still around or something like that, or other things, MySpace, where arguably there was a community, but they didn't own it enough to keep it running after it was shut down.
So yeah, this idea of ownership is important, and this is was made possible through the code, but also through the kind of social work done by these people. Fourth story is while these two websites have survived, the underlying engine, we can't access it on modern computers. In order to see how that software actually worked, we have to do more than just preserve the source code. We have to emulate the underlying system. As I mentioned earlier, some friends helped me to do this for the Everything engine. It's a time-consuming process because it requires that you have not only the right operating system, but all these software packages that they list. And not only that, but you need the exact versions, or not always the exact ones, but you need the right versions. And then those versions are dependent on other software packages and particular versions and so on. So it's a mess, as Niels put it in a slightly different context. It may seem odd, but there's a very useful analogy here between what we were doing and the practice of historical reenactment. So this stuff. Reenactment, of course, generally involves a very close, perhaps obsessive attention to material detail. It's a practice that values authenticity, and that authenticity is often equated with these small details. Small details like using period materials to craft the various clothing, objects, or the food one prepares. Things like that should all be done with the right tools that they had at that time. Oh, and yeah, that'll work. And what I want to emphasize most, though, is that reenactment is often kind of characterized by and marked with a kind of passion and enthusiasm. And as Vanessa Agnew argues, it reflects a sort of broader affective turn in how we relate to history. So while we didn't dress up or anything, I think the reenactment metaphor is still instructive. In some ways, we actually did reconstruct the context and feeling of developing the engine, or at least installing it. A bunch of guys hanging out in a room full of computers, eating takeout food, drinking beer, and playing with software. It was very much a kind of affective and experiential engagement with the past. And I'll never forget when we were really frustrated, like trying to get those exact versions. We were getting all these long lists of errors. Nothing seemed to work. One of my friends turned to me and he said, he like half jokingly, he said, we had successfully recreated the experience of working with open source software at the time, which he had done. And so there's an authenticity there that I think is important. Finally, the story of the Everything engine raises a broader question of what it means to preserve the early web, not just in terms of its content, but also in terms of its production. And by this, I mean emulating the tools, studying code and interfaces and so on, but also importantly, documenting and preserving something like a spirit of early web development. And I think this is an important element to capture. And to give a really short glimpse of what I mean by this, I'll show another clip. This is Nate Ostendorp, who wrote the Everything engine, and Rob Malda, who ran Slashdot. Here they talk about the context in which they created the Everything engine, and you can hear it in their nostalgia, how much they loved it. And so they talk specifically about the apartment that they shared with some friends, where they created all this technology. They called that apartment the Geek House. And this is just one of many examples from the interviews where it becomes clear that there is something like a spirit of the early web, of early web production that could be captured. And perhaps should be captured.
We were friends in high school, but really became, very close in college. We were all roommates, my sort of throughout school. So my freshman year was at a dormitory, and my sophomore year it was, off campus in a rented house, and we called it the Geek House.
What was the Geek House like?
The Geek House was awesome.
And we filled it with a lot of used computer hardware.
I mean, we had all lived in the same dorms, and the Geek Houses were very much like the next step of the dorms, except that we did not have RAs telling us what to do, and we could drink our beers.
And we would find old 386s and 486s and put Linux on them, and just kind of mess around with them.
One day we spray mounted a bunch of paper on a wall to make a movie screen, and then stole a movie projector and watched Star Wars, like on a wall that we would project. Like I remember drilling holes through the floors to run Cat 5 because this is even before wireless, and we had gigantic beanbag chairs and we sat in them, and there would be a hub in the center of the room with 10 base T cables snaking across the room, and we would tell jokes, watch stupid TV shows, and write code all the time.
We were...
Okay, so the passion epitomized by something like the Geek House should, of course, not be naively celebrated. It needs to be understood, historicized, and critiqued. However, I would also note there's something here we can learn from, and I wonder in particular if there might be lessons for those who are trying to create the next alternatives to social media, or in this context, I wonder if there might be lessons here not just for what we should preserve from the early web, but also how we do it. So let me conclude really briefly by returning to the notion of value and adding a bit of theory, namely Boltanski and Thevenot's framework of orders of worth, created largely to kind of answer questions about how people make decisions and resolve conflicts within institutions, companies, and organizations. Each of these categories represents a kind of moral sense that we draw on to justify decisions and so on. But I think it can also be a relevant framework for looking at something like this web production and perhaps even web preservation. So, for example, when we think of how one might normally justify building a website, this might be done by drawing on the market or industrial orders of worth as a way to make money or to solve a problem efficiently. But of course, the web itself and the web development might also be valued in these civic terms, such as the commons of free software development. And I wonder if this is also the mode that best aligns with how we talk about preservation in terms of universal access and, in terms of universal access and so on. But what I want to point out in relation to the stories I've told here, though, is the importance of what could be called, or what they call the inspired order of worth. This should be easier to read. So this emphasis on creativity, authorship, and a break from conventions, and the kind of sort of worth being measured in terms of passion and enthusiasm, I think this aligns very much with a lot of what I've told. And I have a summary here where I go through each point and relate it back to this, but I think I should probably skip that. Yeah. So I'll just end with a very open question. Given the fact that E2 and ProAmongst have survived so long, I started to wonder if there are lessons here for web preservation. If the Everything Engine and those sites were products of an inspired form of web production, that values creativity, authorship, and inspires that within its user base, what might an inspired form of web preservation look like? I have no idea, but if you know, you can email me or let me know some other way, and I'd be happy to hear. Thanks.
One of the videos said, I don't know if sites like Dig still exist. I think it does, but whatever. It doesn't matter. The point is that, maybe the reason that ProAmongst and these other sites still exist is because they were developer-focused sites to begin with, and who's more likely to maintain it than the developers, right? And if a general-purpose news site or something like that, or a link site like that, it's just not going to have that core user base that's going to want to maintain it, right? And even out of all the people who use ProAmongst, I'm sure it's a very small percentage of the people who actually ended up maintaining it, correct?
Absolutely, yeah. I think I will say that everything too is yeah. Is it because they're developers that these sites survived? Everything too is definitely not developer focused. It's more the kind of college literature major crowd, and that survived. Yeah, but I think it's important to see that Stack Overflow, I don't think, allows certain users to have the same level of access to its underlying code. I doubt it. I don't know, but and that had to be in place before ProAmongst could survive in that way. Yeah. it needed a community with real ownership. The governance structure had to be there.
So thank you so much, Michael. Next up, we have Kevin Driscoll, and in the end, if we have time, we're going to return for more questions.
Hello. My name is Kevin Driscoll. I'm visiting from University of Virginia in the US. I'm very happy to be here. I think there's some nice resonance with all of the work that we're doing today. So I'm bringing to you a case that I've struggled with. And hopefully you will have some ideas about this struggle that will help me illuminate the future work. Conversely, I think it will also raise some interesting questions that we couldn't get at through other kinds of problems. So I'll begin with a reorientation, which is to ask a question about building archives of the net. And I arrive at this term through conversations with other colleagues about thinking from a user's point of view, that users arrive at terms like the net because it is open-ended and it describes this like portfolio of networks that do kind of work together sometimes when the wind is blowing in the right direction. And so the net is defined by this collection of services that are joined by bridges, gateways, borders, boundaries. And so if we were to preserve something like a net, make an archive of the net, it would have to be an archive that included all of those edges and the mess that goes between them. So I want to zoom in on one part of this net. And the part of the net that we're going to zoom in on, I'm going to call the modem world, in part because this period of time is determined by whether or not you possess a dial-up modem to connect one type of a bridge, to connect your PC to the telephone network. You must have this gateway in order to enter the modem world. And the modem world is inclusive of many, many, many different types of technologies. And we'll come to see that the web is just one application. So the story will begin with a different class of systems that we'll call dial-up bulletin board systems, or BBSs. If you haven't used a BBS before, there's a really clear metaphor built into the name of the community bulletin board. It's like the computerized version of the community bulletin board where you can go and post up messages for an unknown audience to encounter later in their lives. This is something you'd see at the grocery store, the market, a temple, like different places. And in practice, they generally look like this, like occupying some space in someone's home or the back office of a small business. Many were run by volunteers or as an add-on to a small or medium-sized enterprise. And prior to the privatization of the internet in the US, at least, bulletin board systems were the most common activity among people who identified as modem users. And as will become crucial for our story, the bulletin board system users tended to use more than one. And so in effect, the users, by moving between these different systems, were creating a network of networks, an internet of bulletin board systems, a grassroots kind of intranet. So okay, it's kind of cool story so far. It will raise some questions that may reflect back on our web archiving project. One is that bulletin board systems often became little archives of their own, that people who came to them were motivated not necessarily for the social interaction that was possible there, but because it was really hard to get access to files. The whole ecology of files of the 1970s into the 1990s was really awkward and annoying to use. Media was slow and error-prone, expensive. Different people have different computers, like we are still experiencing today with this ongoing Mac and Windows story. And so the bulletin board could provide a common ground, like a trading space among users of incompatible systems. So it served this kind of purpose. And over time, it becomes a little bit of an archive, but also like a treasure chest, like you find this cache of files when you dial into a new bulletin board system. And people at the time were writing about it much in this way. Like, the reason to get a modem and enter the modem world is to get files. Like, they're out there to be, quote unquote, plundered. Bulletin board system operators, for their part, advertise this use. So you can see, I'll show you some ads for bulletin boards. They'll mention how many megabytes of files there are to be had. Not the quality of the files or the types of files. There's just a lot of them. 160 megs, 200 megs, 260 megs, 270, 1.5 gigabytes. It just keeps growing. And so I've come to see this motivating factor of files in this period. It's often like you come for the files and then you stick around and become part of a community. So once this ecology is happening, some makers of files, software developers and others, would make files that are made to go on these rails to move among this network of small communities. And the class of files I want to focus on, and the one that's been giving me trouble, is shareware. So you may have heard of this term before. It is ambiguous in productive ways, but there's lots of definitions available for people trying to explain shareware to one another. The general idea of shareware is that the developer gives up control of distribution of their software product. So they say, you can have this working program and you can make copies of it. And in fact, I want you to make copies of it. But every copy of the program has a little note attached with that person's contact information, usually their home address and telephone number, and a note that says, please send me money. It's a very counterintuitive scheme, but it's really interesting because it's a perfect case of historical simultaneous invention. So at least 3 people between 1982 and 1983 started circulating programs using the same model. And it was common users of their programs that actually put them in touch with one another. Like one person saying, hey, I know another guy who's giving away his programs for free like a fool. Maybe you guys should talk to each other. So they kind of standardized the names of their programs, and they would shout each other out if they got interviewed in the media, things like that. And they talked about a shrink wrap problem. That was, if you weren't part of this modem world, to get access to a program, you were making a big risk. Like, you would pay for something before ever using it. Maybe you got to see a picture in a magazine, or like a friend told you about it. But in the shareware case, you got to actually use the shareware, decide if you like it, and then decide if you were going to pay for it. Shareware explains itself. So it's this really novel way of distributing what is a product. It's giving away totally this distribution channel and not knowing how people will come to encounter your work in the world. So there's kind of a cool thing that happens here, which is that the most successful shareware programs year after year were ones aimed at people who were already in the modem world. So there's like a little bit of a recursive loop that's happening. So better and better terminal emulators or file compression software, also games for people who have modems. So if you think of Doom as primarily a multiplayer game, the default setting for multiplayer Doom is dial-up modem. And my favorite case is Trumpet Windsock, most relevant to our story because Windows didn't ship with TCP/IP for many years, like much longer than you would expect. And most people who wanted to experience this nascent World Wide Web that we're all talking about would have to get a shareware program called Trumpet Windsock to be able to connect to their ISP and run Mosaic or early Netscape. Very few people knew that Trumpet Windsock was shareware or that they were expected to pay for it. So it's a rare case of an actual court case that brought up the shareware license to see if it was legally defensible, because ISPs in Australia were giving away Trumpet Windsock and not telling their users that it was shareware, and the author, who happened to live there, said, I wish that you would stop doing that. We'll come back to that story. So there are some big success stories in the history of shareware, but they don't look anything like our Silicon Valley success stories. They're not like startups. And the models of success, the ones that are celebrated, look more like small and medium-sized businesses. Like people talk a lot about their joy in being able to employ friends and family, being able to pay for things, revealing information about their personal lives, talking about meeting like-minded people who have similar approach to business, and just being able to turn their hobby into a livelihood. So you see this in Bob Wallace's comment, borrowing from the language of the counterculture to say, I wanted to make a living, not a killing. Similarly, exec PC, which is like a major depot for accessing shareware, was run by a husband and wife couple out of their home, and they frequently posted on the bulletin board about like, welcome to our space. They're very proud about always personally answering all of the queries of potential users, which could include as many as 6,000 callers per day. They also advertise how many millions of files they have. I think they say on this they have the most files. 500,000 messages. Alongside of the production of the programs and some of the distribution nodes like exec-PC, there's all this other interesting shareware stuff that gets made, potentially preserved, like print media, like how-to guides, subscription services where you get like a disc in the mail every month, aggregators who aggregate first on floppies and then later on CD-ROMs, and shareware, it just keeps getting copied into all these different places. So we would think there would be plenty of evidence of this extremely fecund area of the culture industries. So I need to point out a critical piece of this, that in addition to its quirky distribution mechanism, this is an economy based on a shared sense of moral obligation. It is not anti-commercial. It has very different ethics than free and open source software. They're not distributing the source code. It's all executables. And it is business oriented. It's very friendly to a business way of thinking about things. So you see people explain shareware as a business model, a distribution model, marketing strategy. It's just counterintuitive based on all of the experiences that consumers have in like standard modern capitalism, where you observe that there is a service or a product to be had, and then you give money, and then you get access to the thing. Here we reverse it so that you get access to the service, and then you decide if you choose to pay. And there is no technical or legal institution that will force you to pay. So it comes down to a rhetorical strategy that the makers of shareware will have to make an argument to convince you to pay. And you find it in these notes that are left behind in the program. So here's a note from a very popular BBS program where the author says a donation of $25 would be greatly appreciated. From PK Zip, which is where we get the zip format, this one doesn't say donation, it says registration. And you can see like them moving between this different languages of how you might, why or how you might do it. So in the QModem case, you're gonna get a nice typeset manual, a printed manual to use with your program. For CompuShow, you get some extra features that work with different printers. But there are many more strange ones. So there's ones that say it's bad karma if you don't register. Or I'm a witch and I will put hex on you. I'll find out and I will cast a spell on you. This one is a very long personal memo, and I just could only fit one on the slide, and I'm sure you can't read it, but it is a shout out to a friend who introduced the author to the idea of shareware. But then it also includes several relevant passages from the New Testament, and thanks the Lord, the Alpha and Omega, for helping to make the program. And it's like, at first you think, wow, that's weird to put like Bible passage in this licensing document for your software program, except if the economy you exist in is all based in morality. Of course you would put references to your religious beliefs in this document. It is an appeal to an order, to an ethical order. The most common phrase I find is honor code, but it's a code that's never written. It's an implicit honor code. There are efforts people make to elaborate it, like it's an appeal to a higher human quality, but mostly it's vernacular, like hold up your end of the deal. We're in this together. There's a deal somewhere, and we all have an obligation. So shareware exists because the people who made it and the people who used it imagined themselves as part of a community. It was a big enough community that there were strangers in it, but small enough that you could feel a sense of mutual obligation. And the obligation lasts. So in the Trumpet Windsock case, in 2011, former users banded together and raised many thousands of dollars out of a sense of guilt and obligation that they had not paid back in the 1990s. And they sent it to the author. So there's like threads on Hacker News and Reddit about paying back the author, and the author had to make an account on those sites and be like, I'm still here, I live in Tasmania, and thank you for the money. I really did appreciate it. So here's where our story tips into archival stories. Shareware struggled with legitimacy as personal computing continued to boom. more and more people came online. First, the model was extremely confusing. If you didn't already see yourself as part of this community, you couldn't understand this. You didn't know there was an implicit honor code. So why is this person giving me this software for free, and why would I pay them in the future since I already have the program? Similarly, there was kind of a stigma of earlier online systems. So as more and more people are encountering the ideas like internet and information superhighway from television and from politicians and things like that, then the BBS world, in the actual term BBS, is marked as something that's for teenagers or criminals or pornographers. It is unprofessional. If you want to go online, you should use an ISP, not a BBS. It's like a war of acronyms. And unfortunately for shareware authors, they were marked as the form of software that goes with BBSs. So whatever stigma landed on BBS got moved onto the shareware. The moral economy kind of fell apart. There was a lack of collective identity. A way of thinking about it is there was shareware still, there is today still shareware, but there is no honor code. There's no sense of being enmeshed in this sense of mutual moral obligation. And so shareware didn't get preserved systematically in the same way that bulletin board systems largely have not been preserved systematically by institutional archives. And I've been thinking about this as foreclosing on possible futures, that there is some kind of alternative future that's still available to us, articulated in those little passages that accompanied all those software programs. So we can't allow stigma in one moment, like one moment stigma to lead to neglect in the long term. So to date, all shareware preservation has been done through amateur labor. And I use the word amateur in its root of the amateur, the love. This person does it because they love shareware. But that's not an ethical arrangement for me as a professional media historian, to rely on amateur labor with no kind of mutual support. That doesn't meet the shareware honor code. So we need to be thinking about ways to support preservations of weird phenomena like shareware. And in 1993, like right at this turning point around this stigma story, Bob Metcalf wrote in his column in PC Mag, shareware is a model of how we will all acquire software in the future. And I think from my description, you might hear echoes of it in the ways that you acquire software now. If you get a trial version or a demo, or you download an app from a marketplace, and then you're asked later to pay to get an extra feature or more time playing Candy Crush or whatever, that some of the mechanics of shareware were extracted from its moral economy. So we got all of the mechanical side of that economy, but none of the ethics and none of the moral sense of obligation or community. So I hope through this talk and this encounter with shareware, we can see that there was here articulated a sense of an alternative economic imaginary, how the political economy of online systems might have worked differently. And it kind of vanishes right around the same time as most people get access to something like the World Wide Web. So many people in the web didn't get to experience that sense of being in a community big enough to have strangers, but small enough to feel mutual obligation with one another. And so I guess in a depressing way, you might say we're worse off for this forgetting because we lost access to those futures. But it's a provocation because it asks us to interrogate what sorts of stigmas exist in our social worlds today, our social and technical worlds, that we might be inadvertently preserving in our work. That there are boundaries that we might not be observing or we might not be interrogating that we are recreating in our archival work, which will foreclose futures for future users, future patrons of the materials that we're collecting. So thank you very much.
Incredibly difficult. No, this is impossible. I'm just going. Okay. Very short questions, please.
Oh, that's no pressure.
Kevin answers. Yeah.
Kevin, do you know the current site Patreon?
Yeah, yeah.
So that I think is a really interesting embodiment of all this mix of moral sort of models of moral economy that you're talking about.
Yeah, no doubt.
Because there are guys who they have kind of sponsor me and you get exclusive stuff that other people don't get. But there are also people on there who basically I give all the things I make, which are often kind of they're making all sorts of stuff, not just software. But there is still an element of that kind of if you like this, sponsor me here, and the reward you get is the warm feeling of sponsoring me and an acknowledgement, right? So it's there, but perhaps it's moved to a different context.
Yeah, I may be unusual in this, but there are several people whose amateur style labor makes my own academic research possible, who I try to support as generously as I can on Patreon. And I'm not getting nothing for it. I'm getting extremely valuable cultural heritage work that isn't supported by other existing institutions.
Yeah.
So
and Patreon, you set the value. I mean, they set the price, you set the value. Yeah. Crowdfunding more generally, I think, is a surviving and quite vital version of the shareware with more modern economics to it.
Yeah, I think something that's striking about the shareware story is about the problems of payment that faced these folks. And so in a way, I'm like channeling the voice of my partner, who is a researcher studying money systems. And she would say, like, wow, of course, this is so odd. They ask you to mail a check. That probably limits the number of people willing to register this software. And so crowdfunding is an idea that I'm sure we can find like early echoes of in like the Whole Earth catalog and other places, but there wasn't the apparatus yet to enable the pooling of money with trust. And, there's like these issues that come along with payments infrastructure, and the ones that were available to people, like cash and checks, had some limitations.
Well, Craigslist went to Airbnb, for example, adding trust, adding escrow.
Yeah, there's a kind of trust there. Although many Airbnb listings, I can read between the lines and see that they are actually corporations pretending to be friends. Yeah, trust rusts.
So there were previously also more questions for Michael and Megan. Yeah. You had the previous? Yeah. Because we were just granted a few more minutes.
Hi. So I think the concept of time and the notion of time through the historic archive is very fascinating, and I also think it's not a mistake. I don't think one person came up with it and the other copycatted it. I think it's really, from the linguistic, cognitive point of view, it's a metaphor we live by. It's not like the foot of the mountains. We actually think of it as a time machine. I think it's also a site that's really interesting to think about in the term of German phenomenology of Husserl against the French phenomenology of Merleau-Ponty, because I think it's not that we experience it in the French phenomenological way. We don't think of it as we're in a matrix and we experience the past. It's more in a Husserl way, meaning that we see the past through the window. And because of that, I think that thinking about the Facebook story, I think, what is the memory, when I'm thinking about today, it's almost the opposite of what it said, because lately social media has become a thing of the present, a synchronic thing of the now, and Facebook has become a thing of the past. So it's trying to fight this thing by saying the things that were in the past, not at all. They're right now. The past memories, it's a thing of now. I think the main thing about story and what's it called, the Telegram and Snapchat, is that you send it now and it exists now. There's no more nostalgia in the social media. So I think it's contrary to the
That's
thinking.
the eternal ephemeral, that idea that it creates something new. I was just going to say what you were bringing up, and I'm not that familiar with all of the phenomenology references, a little, but just thinking about what you were saying about how these digital archives create something new. That was the term that Chun had used, was eternal ephemeral, to try to capture that, the sense that this isn't something from the past, just by version of it coming out again. This is like Throwback Thursday, or any of these, like, take something from your past and like represented it as new, and then it becomes something new while old at the same time, I guess. I don't know. But yeah, interesting. I'd like to talk to you more about it.
I also previously saw an extra hands for a question from Michael. Who was that in the room? Okay, here. Oh.
Just a technical question. How did you manage to get all those software? Yes.
Lovely question. Let's get the mic.
Well, the operating systems, I realized you could get the Internet Archive. Some of those software packages, the Perl has a CPAN, it's called, and it's an archive, but it's not totally complete. We ended up finding some stuff on some old FTP sites that are still up, like some Belgian university that I have to thank or something like that. And it's just, there's an FTP site that someone hasn't probably looked at in years. And it had a sort of copy of a CD that had some of these files or something like that. Yeah.
One or two more questions here? Yeah.
Thanks. I'm going to go back to Kevin. Patreon is a good example, but I think the model that many podcasts are running by is exactly that, right? Here's the podcast, and then every now and then they'll have a 2-minute, extremely morally loaded appeal for money, which is also about community. And I maybe want to go a step further and say there's something about the medium which creates this, which makes that kind of model maybe appropriate both for BBSs and for podcasts. And I'm quoting here my PhD student who's starting research on podcasts, and she thinks that what's special about them is that they're in your ear, and that there's an intimacy and an authenticity of the relationship between you and the podcast artist or presenter. So maybe that future hasn't entirely been foreclosed, and maybe there's something about the medium of podcast that it doesn't invite, but makes, I don't know, some kind of synergy with this model of funding.
Yeah, if I was to venture a comparative analysis, it's in both the case of the bulletin board systems and in the podcasts, the barrier to creating seems very low. And so many podcasts are very DIY, and when you listen, you have the sense like, I could be making a podcast of my own, whether I am or not. And I think with the bulletin board systems, there is a lot of this like parity between the user and the operator, that there was a sense of peership. So even if you are not operating your own bulletin board system, like you might one day. And so that when they pass the hat and ask for help paying the phone bill, you may be inclined to pay in that way. Yeah, that intimacy part is very intriguing, especially the connection to early radio studies and the moral panics about women listening to men speaking in their ears and things like this. Like, there's something there.
Okay, so the last question of this session.
Maybe a question to all of you, which relates to methods, because I think most of you did not use web archives or studied a period that was prior to the early web, or just the beginning of. So perhaps a few words on how you see the importance of oral and material history in doing web histories.
Yeah, I would just say that, I mean, there's a guy named Henry Lowood, sort of cultural preservation scholar, I think at Stanford, who also mentioned this connection with reenactment, and to what extent archivists can use this idea, can bring in some of the ideas of reenactment into how we preserve, technology, how we preserve the web. A few years ago, Megan and I were in Berlin at the Computerspiel Museum, and they had these great sort of simulated environments of like a teenage bedroom in Germany in sort of 1982 or whatever, and you would play your Nintendo system in that environment. I don't know. It was a pretty cool way of getting towards some of that reenactment stuff while also clearly performing a kind of classical preservation role, and maybe something like that.
Would that reenactment appeal to anybody except somebody who was a teenager in 1982?
That's a good question. I think there is an inherent value in seeing something strange. As yeah.
They're like little capsules.
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah. Well,
it's
yeah.
like the lava lamp, and like it's like, oh yeah, the '94 lava lamp, not the
Yeah.
60s
Well,
lava
I mean, it's like I show the everything or the Everything 2 site, and everyone's kind of nodding along because they've seen similar stuff with social media today. But there's also stuff like, why did they do that? Or there's some strangeness that I think is going to be valuable.
Yeah, I actually used a lot of unusual sources for that project, ongoing, and there are a lot of web archives that are, or archived web pages that are part of it, but they don't make for like great images on your slide. But this project is about this overlapping period where people were dialing bulletin boards and using websites, and like the Association of Shareware Professionals was a trade group that tried to promote shareware and really battled against the stigma, and they publish a lot online, including interviews with shareware authors that were a major source of like quotations and things in this presentation. So it was there, even if not totally obvious.
Oh boy, what to say? Okay, well, I was just going to say, in my work, what has been useful is sort of like triangulating web archives with other sources. One of the things, as being trained in like media history, I had to learn from scratch what the little that I do know about how web archives are created. Yeah, and so now I'm losing my train of thought. Where was I going with that? Yeah, triangulate. How many times I would see a copy of something. This was a case with like the Zima website of like '95. There's a version of it on like Frontline. They're doing a thing on digital advertising. There's a version of it in the Wayback Machine. There's a version of it in like a production manual. Every single one is different. So it's like, well, what did it really look like? And then for me, that was the question of maybe that's not the right question. When we think about websites, the idea, as someone who once designed websites, I thought my job was to make it look the same on every single screen and device. That's what the client wanted. But the reality is it's different for every single person. I think that needs to be part of the way that we conceptualize it.
Wonderful. So I would like to thank all the contributors to this panel.